Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session devoted to the Arms Trade Treaty. First of all, thank you very much for participating into it, against the background of a fierce competition between many different sessions. So we're very grateful to see you in the room. I'm Pierre-Arnaud. I work for the External Action Service. And as you know, the Arms Trade Treaty has been a top priority for the EU over the past years. We have very much engaged into awareness raising, then the negotiation of the treaty, and now, further to its entry into force, assisting in its hopefully effective implementation. And that's the topic for today's session. I'll be brief. I think we certainly all agree that, despite little shortcomings here and there, the ATT is a diplomatic success. That's true. Entry into force has been pretty quick. There is a large number of states parties and a good, a background of signatories that, hopefully will join sooner as states parties. CSP1 in Cancun has been substantive with, and almost conclusive on each and every important issues. Possibly, the reporting still has to be tweaked a little bit. So yes, it's a diplomatic success. But what we want, is, this diplomatic success to translate into a success on the ground, which means that we would like that, to translate into effective national regulations with good enforcement capacities. We would like, industry and operators to integrate the regulation pursuant to the Arms Trade Treaty into their daily operations. Of course, again, with a good enforcement and a good outreach to industry as incentives to do so. I don't think we would like this treaty, which so far is a diplomatic success, to turn into we are aware of, too many treaties that have, remained lofty pieces of paper with very ambitious, very, well-crafted and designed provisions that actually, proved in the end not fully or not effectively implemented. This is certainly a risk for the Arms Trade Treaty. We would like this to be avoided. That's why, implementation matters. So the question, ahead of us might be, with everyone's, contribution, how to move from a diplomatic success to actually, a success in terms of customs enforcement, industry compliance, and licensing, daily work. To address this, how to move forward towards an effective implementation, we have three distinguished panelists. I'm very grateful to them for their presence today. I won't involve into lengthy presentations of them. You can read all the impressive details of their biographies online via the dedicated application. They are, by the way, very, very well known already to us. So with that, I think we can go into the substance right now. And for that, I'll give the floor to Elli. Please, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre-Arnaud. And thank you, of course, to the EU Non-Proliferation Consortium and all the partners for the invitation again to be here for these 2 days. I think the first time I was here sitting, I think in this very room, was the first consortium conference in February 2012, and at that time our topic was conventional arms or something like that, and it felt a bit, I have to say, like a sidekick to the rest of the program that was very much sort of WMD centered, but I've been really glad to see over the years that not only have you kept this agenda item, but it's become stronger, I think, and of course as the Arms Trade Treaty process has developed, so has our topics and our discussions here. And goes without saying that I'm very glad that here we are now talking about implementation, no longer about how to get there in terms of getting the treaty, but what shall we do now? I thought I would, as a kickoff, just to give a quick overview of the current state of play in the ATT membership and present some regional dynamics, and also from my side just highlight some what I think are interesting developments and points in this. I had thought that I would also like to mention, aside from the membership, some critical areas for the treaty implementation more generally, but knowing that we're quite pressed in time, I leave it to the chair to decide whether I should continue talking or maybe save these three delicacies till the end when we hopefully have a lively discussion. So, as Pierre-Arnaud said, we now have an ATT in force. It's almost since a year now. The ATT, as I'm sure you all know, entered into force on Christmas Eve last year. We got there in quite great speed, I have to say. And I, again, thinking back to this very meeting last year, beginning of September, I think I was the skeptical one saying that, I don't think we'll have ATT in force in 2014, but I'm very glad that we did. And I was wrong. So to have the ATT, we needed 50 ratifications. Currently, we're way beyond that. We have 78 states parties in the treaty, and in total, 130 countries have signed the treaty. Now that the ATT is in force, you can't sign it anymore. So you have sort of 50 countries left who signed it before the entry into force and are, at least from my perspective, very likely to hopefully join it as state parties in the near future. So good progress so far. Big pushes, I'd say, in this getting to the implementation were, of course, the first committee last September to get over the initial 50 ratifications. And then there was a second big push after that, earlier this year, to have as many countries as possible to join in time before the first conference of states parties that was held in Cancun, Mexico, in August. And looking at these pushes, I can't help but think, and this is sort of a question to the audience as well, I'm wondering what the third next push could be. Now that we're at 78, what can we say is the next important treaty landmark that could be used for states to encourage keeping up the speed and continuing joining the treaty in the very good pace that we've had so far. When we talk about these accessions, there's often, at least I hear, talk about, among other things, the question about who are we getting along, who do we have on board and who not, and are there some countries and accessions that would be more important than others. And should we be looking at those aside of the mere numbers and statistics? Here, of course, one of the arguments you get is big players. You need the big players on board. As we know, out of the P5, two, the European ones, UK and France, are state parties, while US signed back in 2013, and Russia and China are so far outside the treaty. So often, or sometimes you at least hear people calling for more action that should be directed to the P5 and other large exporters. Now, I think, while of course, yes, it's important, but from my perspective, especially when you think about conventional arms, I'd like to think of it less as a sort of P5-led process and more numbers that would count for a global norm change. We've seen this in other conventional arms processes, and I think what we have started seeing in the ATT is very encouraging in this regard. It's not only about getting the big exporters on board, but it's about starting the global change, and that's what we've done already, I think. So, personally, I wouldn't put too much pressure on who the ratifications at this stage are, but really the overall universalization process. Now, linked to this is, of course, the question about regions. Are there then regional differences in enthusiasm towards the treaty. And would or should that matter, and what should we do about it? And I think when we look at regions, definitely, yes, there are differences. And I think here is where I would be more attentive and like us to think a bit further about how to truly globalize the accession and implementation of the treaty. As Pierre-Arnaud mentioned, one of the champions of the process has been Europe, among them EU as a strong supporter. And another very strong geographical area for the treaty has been Americas. There, for example, CARICOM as a regional organization. Those were sort of on board since the beginning of the process and have continued their support throughout. But then there are other regions, sort of more gray areas or even black spots, covering parts of Asia and Pacific in particular, and parts of Africa, where so far accession rates are very low. A few words maybe in more detail about those. In Europe, my apologies, my regions are always a bit, I tried to follow the UN regional division, but don't look at the numbers, just look at the sort of more wider picture. In my Europe, 37 out of 43 European countries have joined the treaty. So we have about 85% of countries in this region committed to the ATT. As said, has been strong since the outset, active countries in the process. Of course, one can say it's been relatively easy for these countries because they already had quite highly developed transfer control systems, many large players in the conventional arms field, and they had already developed regional criteria and norms that were then easily adaptable to ATT's requirements. And of course, I'd say in Europe, one strong influence was that of regional organizations and export control regimes, very strong here. Americas, which I mentioned, it was another, or is another strong region for the ATT, is for me interesting because it's sort of more divided than Europe, both in terms of country profiles, but also in terms of the individual countries' attitudes towards the treaty. But still, in general, the region has been very supportive. We have 20 out of 35 OAS countries in the ATT, which is, 57%, so just over half. There are interesting cases, as I said, obviously the US being one that had lots of discussions around it, especially in the couple of years ago in the process. Also Canada now, many eagerly waiting for a new member there. And I'd like to again highlight CARICOM as a regional organization that was very strongly supporting the treaty negotiations and has been supporting its membership to join the treaty. Currently 12 of the CARICOM members have joined the treaty. If you think about Americans and say CARICOM as a region, it's probably not the most obvious candidate region to be a core supporter for an ATT if you think about that traditional sort of big exporter angle to this. But I think what they've done quite well in the region is amassing the support of civil society, the different partners in this whole arms trade issue, and managed to show how the arms trade treaty is also an armed violence and community security issue, and that is very that can bring benefits also to countries that themselves are not maybe on a daily basis exporting weapons, for example. They also have some good cases of regional champions that I think have had a strong influence in making Americas a success. Say Mexico's support to the process, especially in the past couple of years. Trinidad and Tobago, they're running for the secretariat and being really pushing this in CARICOM as examples. But then, when we move to the other regions in grand scale, Africa, I have to say, I personally feel a bit puzzled, but fortunately there are two other panelists here that I have way more insight into that part of the world than I do. Just sort of at the general level, I feel in the beginning of the process there was huge enthusiasm from Africa. We had Kenya as one of the co-authors, lots of regional meetings, the countries wanted to learn more. I was frankly thinking they are going to amass the numbers in terms of accession. Yet, at the moment, we have 16 out of the 54 African states, so just under 30% parties to the treaty. I should say that we have 23 signatories, which is sort of encouraging, and I'm thinking, and it's just my take, that maybe part of it might be how long processes take nationally for accession, and that Africa hopefully will be, from my perspective, will be a region where we'll see more accessions coming in the near future. Because I think, like in the Americas, what we've seen in the African region is strong cooperation between the different stakeholders. There's been a lot of civil society and regional organization activity, and it is clearly an issue for Africa, especially if you look at the small arms side of things, illicit trafficking, the negative effects of uncontrolled trade. This should definitely be a case for more African members in the treaty in the very near future. Here I'm thinking whether part of the reason, in addition to national complexities, could be a sort of a lack of a regional leader or a sort of profile in the area. If you compare again with Americas, where you have some champions, or Europe as well, what that could be, and is there one that I just haven't really seen? Would be interesting to know. And then probably from my side, the darkest spot and the biggest region, I've put them all together, Asia Pacific. It's of course a super wide area, but generally there is very low commitment. 5 countries out of the 61 that I've mapped here are parties to the ATT, so 8%. 19 signatures, but still, really that's the region that has the lowest commitment to the process so far. Again, unfortunately, nothing much new. It has been like that since the beginning of the process, I'd say, and we've seen some of it in other, at least conventional arms processes, where I know many countries in the region struggle with their commitments on other related instruments as well. The reasons for that, I don't know. I'd say sort of probably it has to do with the traditional defense and sovereignty debate that is surrounding the arms trade and transfer issues in many of the countries. Might also be sort of cultural and sort of wait-and-see attitude, rather seeing what will happen before joining. That's at least what I've heard from some of the countries who, from my perspective, could easily join ATT but have decided to stay out of it for the time being. Then there are, of course, regional tensions that probably play into this. And here, comparing to Africa, of course, the situation is different because you don't have maybe so many sort of open conflict, but more like arms races that make it more difficult to build confidence and to decide jointly that we're going to join something like the Arms Trade Treaty. And here, again, more of a question. I'm wondering about the importance of strong regional powers in Asia. Russia, of course, could be counted as playing, having a role in this region, but as a sort of a positive development that I wanted to highlight, we saw China becoming more active in the past year or so. They participated in the first Conference of States Parties as an observer, and just recently also spoke in the first committee about the Arms Trade Treaty and said that they are very committed to the object and purpose of the treaty and are looking into the possibility of accession. So don't have a crystal ball. I don't know how that would affect, but if China were to join very soon, I wonder how that and whether that would have any impact on the regional dynamics in Asia. Here, a final word about Asia versus other regions. It seems that in the others, regional organizations, if anything, have been pushing for the accession and helping, like, say, CARICOM or the EU. But if one counts, for example, the League of Arab States into this region, we see that only one League member has joined the ATT. 7 have signed. But there, the dynamics doesn't seem to have worked the same way as in some other regions. And the same goes for the, say, Pacific Islands Forum as a regional organization, that maybe they could be utilized a bit more in terms of spreading the word and maybe mobilizing action towards the treaty. That was a sort of world in 5 minutes. I think, as I said, generally, I think studying the regional and, of course, national reasons on the flip side of the coin, why states have not joined the ATT so far, will be very interesting and very important in the next 1 or 2 years when we start analyzing the treaty and see how the first steps of its implementation go. I did have the 3 general points, but do you want me to save them for later? Or okay. So that was the membership. Otherwise, I think some priority areas for the next 2 years are, generally speaking, the institutional structures. We've now, in Cancun, established the secretariat. We have the interim head of secretariat. Will be in Geneva, as you know. And I think it will be important to put enough thinking and resources to ensuring that we get this right from the beginning. This was very much said in Cancun, but it is something that where the pressure is still on and needs to continue. Related to this is, of course, continued and stepped up support for both the members and the signatory states, and, as Pierre-Arnaud mentioned, cooperation across the board with different players. Related to the institutional structures, a very crucial area to me is the reporting regime, and it's something that it is part of the institutional structure, but it's so much more that I wanted to mention that separately. We will have the first set of national reports coming in May next year. The formats are still being worked out and fine-tuned, but I think this is a crucial area where we have to pay attention to make sure that we will build a transparency regime that will support the implementation of the treaty and its objectives in the best possible manner. And finally, my number 3 was external factors and outreach. of course, external factors being other political things happening, which we can't really, in the ATT sphere, influence that much, but I think they will be crucial also in playing into how the treaty will be implemented. One part of this is, of course, the media, what we start seeing, if anything there, related to the ATT, and how countries that have joined will be able to show that they are effectively implementing and making a difference on the ground. And then, of course, outrage, what to do with regard to those countries and regions that are currently not part of this regime. How can we encourage them to at least start a dialogue, learn more, and eventually, hopefully, join the treaty? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elli, not least for the regional insight. It was very, very informative. Now I think I'll give the floor to Noel. That's right? Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think between the two of us, we might respond to some of the questions you asked, but probably not directly. The ATT represents a change in how the international community defines and addresses common security challenges. In adopting the ATT, states are seeking to improve oversight over international arms transfers by addressing the trade more from a human security perspective. The organization I work for, the Institute for Security Studies, although I don't directly work on this issue, I must admit, has received money from UNSCAR, the UN ODA administered fund, to do work in Africa in promoting implementation, ratification and implementation of the ATT. So I'm going to talk about some of our experiences in this regard, and our present work obviously follows years of work in assisting African states in implementing other relevant international and continental arms control instruments, including obviously the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and other regional and sub-regional policies and measures. So from our activities and maybe from an African perspective, I want to raise three concerns. And the first one is reporting fatigue. As it was mentioned, the ATT requires each state to submit annually to the Treaty Secretariat a report of the preceding year's authorized or actual export and imports of conventional weapons covered under Article 2.1. I think we must be careful not to fall into the UN Security Council Resolution 1540 trap of assuming that the rate of implementation can be judged by the number of reports submitted. Though the submission of a report can be seen as a significant implementation step, it does not represent an indicator of the level of implementation. In Africa, we have competing priorities: health, education, poverty, and a lack of capacity. And we also have reporting fatigue. So in many areas of the work that ISS does, we often get the complaint from under-resourced African governments that there are just too many reports to write and submit to the UN. So I would argue that, and you mentioned the need to report as the next challenge. I think reports might be slow, but it's better to have a quality report which takes time and contains accurate information rather than submitting a superficial report just to kind of tick the box, as it were. In fact, I think the only value of such reports should be to enable the particular state to identify where assistance may be required and where they need to tighten policies and processes. The other problem, of course, in terms of reporting is that many African governments, in particular the defense forces, remain reluctant to divulge any information on their accumulation of arms, assuming that transparency will compromise the safety of citizens. I would worry that the section in the ATT that allows states to exclude commercially sensitive or national security information will be used and maybe even abused by states. My second concern relates to the illegal or illicit arms flows between African states. So the ATT also seeks to reduce the illicit arms trade through diversion control. Our experience shows that there seems to be some confusion between the ATT and the UN Programme of Action. African states, it's true, have invested much in the UN Programme of Action and sub-regional instruments that came out of that politically binding instrument, such as the SADC Firearms Protocol, the ECOWAS moratorium, which was then turned into a convention, etc., as a means to prevent the illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons. So the emergence of the ATT requires a change in attitude and a mindset on the part of African states in respect to both general transparency and that the issue is really about the legal trade of the full range of conventional weapons, their parts and components. Linked to this is obviously also the fact that, according to Reaching Critical Will, throughout the treaty negotiations and since its entry into force, there have been countless examples of so-called irresponsible arms transfers. Many of the weapons transferred by states, parties, signatories and non-states parties alike have ended up being used to commit crimes and violate the laws covered by the treaty. And this includes in Africa, if you look at South Sudan, Nigeria, etc. Another important question linked to this is whether the ATT will be able to prevent the illicit circulation of weapons within Africa. For years, I include myself, have conveniently blamed the flow of arms to Africa on exporters in the north. With the eventual effective implementation of the ATT by producing countries in Europe and elsewhere, intra-Africa trade, both legal and illegal, will hopefully be exposed and addressed. Importantly, I want to raise one of the key elements that might be overlooked, but which is important especially in relation to developing countries, including African states. And that is that the spectrum of the supply chain covered includes not only export controls, but imports, transits, transshipments and brokering. When you look at the states that are party to the ATT, a large number obviously are key exporters, but most states are not major exporters. Rather, these states play a role in the trade in other forms, either as importers or they serve as locations where large amounts of shipping and freight pass through, so transit kind of countries. So the development of particular national systems that addresses the trade from that perspective would, I think, be important. And this means looking beyond export control systems. So, for example, customs legislation should be looked at in more detail to see if national controls can more effectively assist in preventing diversion. Another example, which I think you mentioned, is the transport of such goods and the national legislation that regulates the movements of goods by road, rail, sea, etc., to see if these can be strengthened. These might not be the obvious areas to look at in terms of arms regulation, but are important in an African context, and more attention should be paid to them. The third issue I want to raise is around assistance. During the negotiation process, many states highlighted the need for the treaty to include provisions for financial, technical, and material assistance. This is important as being able to control arms transfers carries resource implications. Many states in Africa face important challenges, as I mentioned, in terms of human and technical resources, and only a limited number on the continent have appropriate laws and have established appropriate coordination mechanisms and domestic controls. to be in a position to cover the full spectrum of the ATT. So consequently, of course, African states and other developing nations will need legal and or administrative assistance from other states or from African civil society in order to be able to effectively implement the treaty. And I know, and I won't go through it, but I know that the EU ATT outreach project is doing great work in this regard, and they recently had a seminar workshop in South Africa, Pretoria. Although slow, many African states have indeed been reviewing and at a sub-regional level even been trying to harmonize their legislation. But this has been mainly in terms of the UN Programme of Action. Now, how do we get them to incorporate obligations under the ATT without creating greater confusion and another time-consuming process? In terms of the kind of assistance that some states will need, I also go back to my earlier point about states considering their role in the supply chain of arms transfers and ensuring that the national laws are appropriate for that situation. For example, elaborate and complicated export control systems, such as many EU states have, is probably not necessary. Assistance in developing suitable and effective import systems would be more valuable. States will need some form of export control. However, some states will need some form of export control because even the movement of a small number of arms across the border is still an export. But the emphasis on assistance shouldn't be that all states have sophisticated exports controls. I'm going to skip this section. Just going back to the EU assistance, I mean, we do need to raise the question, how sustainable are these assistance programs? Given the fact that in most, I don't think Africa is unique in this, but in the diplomatic and civil service, attrition is at a high level. And the oversight bodies deal with a range of issues. I mean, if you go to Lesotho, for example, there are 2 people in the department that deals with disarmament and non-proliferation, dealing with chemical, biological, nuclear, 1540, UN Programme of Action, SADC protocol. So it's really difficult. So we've got to ask how sustainable is the assistance programs, and one would hope that there will be more forthcoming. I think we also need to concur with, Chatham House wrote a paper recently, and I think we need to concur with that and really promote the idea that the Arms Trade Treaty has potential implications across a variety of policy areas and can assist in advancing our national development plans and goals, and now the UN Sustainable Development Goals. From an African perspective, that the SDGs and the treaty have a lot in common, linking disarmament and development, more specifically SDG 16.4 on reducing arms flows. As the first treaty of its kind, the ATT can potentially help states to start making a significant difference in their arms exports and imports to ensure that they are compatible with their own as well as global development goals. However, a great deal of work will need to be done to balance the different conceptions by states of the actual purpose of the treaty, the related but potentially divergent objectives of the need for international standards to regulate international trade in conventional arms, and the need to prevent the diversion of conventional weapons. And I think these are 2 quite divergent issues covered by the treaty. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noel, also for reminding us that the Amsterdam Treaty is actually also about, imports, transit, and transshipment, and these are issues that, should not be downplayed in the implementation as well. Finally, and I'm very happy that Olatokunbo will, from UNREC, will have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre-Arnaud. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share a few thoughts. I think the two speakers who went before me have already kind of laid the foundation. So I'm just going to look at a couple of things, and I'm going to start with the whole question of universalization and where is Africa in this commitment. And it's the question of commitment that has been raised. Is ratification commitment? At what is it? What are the indicators we're going to have on the table in order to show that Africa is committed to this treaty? The question of one of the founding fathers or co-authors who has not yet even signed up to the treaty, I think should be the starting point for our interrogating the whole notion of commitment. And from there, I look at political will as moving away from an interested diplomat, a group of interested diplomats managing to convince somebody that we need to ratify something, and then there's a change in the system, and then it's gone. So for me, I move from just individuals, groups of individuals, to the whole notion of national ownership. What does ATT mean for the average African? And I think if it is going to work, that has to be part of the future perspectives we need to look at. How does the average African who is being hacked down, raped, or caught in a war or civil, what do they understand by the ATT being important in order for there to be a movement from, what we used to call the bottom up, as opposed to just signing to join the bandwagon? I come from a human rights background, and this is where that whole bottom-up approach for me becomes important. Like the ATT, like the many other treaties in different other fields, Africa was jumping onto treaties in the human rights, jumping in and off because they'd signed something and then they'll violate the rights the next day. And the question was, how are we going to increase or improve implementation? It meant having to actually build, having to support a strong movement beyond non-governmental organizations, but cutting across the board. And when we say civil society, we mean civil society from the bigger perspective. But I think that with the ATT, it goes beyond that. It's the competing authorities, and you've named them. The military, who think everything is sacred and is secret. The politicians, who are trying to use the military to keep themselves alive. The media that is running between whatever is sexy, it's environment today, it's climatic change tomorrow, so we're on it. Name it. But those are the realities. And yes, talk about African coordinating mechanisms. We've got them. Regional economic communities. So define the ATT for the African. What is it? Something that is there so that the West will not sell us arms? Maybe that's what my aunt or somebody would say. Yeah, I think I heard about it. Something that is there so that the West will not sell us arms. But how do I get to know anything about that? I'm not in government. What's the role for the parliament in Africa in this process? For me, these are where the questions are at. So the national ownership concept has to be redefined, and then we can begin to use this to build. And I think also in terms of the numbers, my concern is not too much how many African countries have ratified. My question is how many countries are going to implement. So I think the challenge ahead of us is not in the numbers only. It's in the question of those who have ratified, what are they going to do? And here you just need to take a look at the number of countries that have ratified, and you find that majority are in West Africa. And somebody asked me the question, why West Africa? my first reaction was, well, the role of ECOWAS, the convention, its capacity to build WANZA up as a civil society that was able to mobilize around this. Maybe that's the reason. But these are kind of seem to be the things you can touch. Now, what does that mean? That means that ECOWAS, and it has continued to, and the discussions continue. Actually, next week, the AU's Small Arms and Light Weapons Steering Committee meeting, which will take place in Abuja, is also going to be looking at some of these issues. That is to buttress the point that has been made by my two predecessors, that we cannot, we have to sell this as a total package. It's got to be ATT, UNPOA, whatever, because for the average country, you can't make a distinction between these different processes. Therefore, if you have in West Africa an ECOWAS that is up until today willing to push more because it's concerned about the fact that there are many wars and we don't have borders and so on and so forth, then the fruits of that process need to be seen much more in a broader perspective by other subregions. Because I asked the question, with ISS in Southern Africa, why are the SADC countries not on board? One would have imagined that they would be on board, but they're not. There are only two countries in Southern Africa that are on board. And the two of them participated in the small islands, developing countries seminar that UNREC supported. So we kind of think, okay, maybe because of a lot of pressure here and there, they jumped on board. So I think for us, these are the questions that we really need to be looking at. So it's, as I said, two levels of work. Get more people to ratify, but get those who have ratified to start doing something and start showing why it is important to ratify. And through the existing mechanisms on the continent, especially at the level of the AU, begin to push this question, not just of ratification, but also of implementation. From an UNREC perspective, we're looking, in summary, at these two areas, and we're, depending on what role the UN will continue to play in this process, the strengthening and the building of national capacity, it will be very important for us. And in that regard, our center in Lima developed a manual for training, which is now being adapted for Africa. And this kind of training is not just geared to the military or people in the Ministry of Defense, but to everyone in that chain. So define the chain: customs, export control, civil society, media, everyone, so that we get a better understanding of the importance of the treaty. As has been said, we think also that the newly adopted SDGs create the right environment. Because as Noel rightly said, the average African tells you, my problem is health, it's education, it's whatever. But if there are wars going on, and these wars really, I think they wouldn't be as violent if there were no arms in circulation, except you can draw those links. Both the SDGs and the ATT will fail. So I think the fact that the world is bold enough to draw the links now, we need to build on that. So that, yes, as I'm selling the ATT and somebody is saying, but my problem is education, we can draw the links between the inability to go to school because Boko Haram has taken over, or I don't know, whoever else is, except we can draw those links. The other parts that we're looking at now, and we actually have a non-SCA supported meeting to look at, it's those provisions related to women, to gender, to the humanitarian concerns, and the importance of the ATT, the Articles 6, 7, 8 issues, to, again, use that to mobilize. Because when we're looking at Africa, I mean, the greatest, I believe, the man will agree with me, that women are very important in this process. In the process of carrying the news, in the process of spreading the message. And so we want to really look more at that, in that area. A lot of initiatives are out there, and one is which we are doing with CIPRI on actually just having information about what has happened, what is happening, and what is going to be happening, and actually get that out there. And so there is a database on activities around these issues, which is being finalized, and which needs to be kept alive, and which needs to reach a bigger society, members of the society in the continent. So my questions are this: who are we targeting? Maybe we need to refocus. Maybe we need to move this from the defense, security, everything that's jittery, to where it really belongs in practice. Because it's not just about the military. It's also about lawmakers. It's also about, border control. It's also about media. It's also about everyone. So let's move it into that bigger sphere. Second issue that I thought, it's the follow-up mechanisms. The follow-up mechanisms at the national level, they have to be as diverse as they come in terms of not creating entities that are kind of monocolor, if you want, but something that can be, comment on dit en français, souple, that can be flexible to be able to accommodate everyone in terms of promoting the importance of the ATT. The question about regional champions, I think both, just as we look at the need for regional champions, we need to look for the national champions as well. And this could be different. The regional champions could be in terms of institutions, mechanisms. It could be even in terms of individuals. I don't know, the Kofi Annans who run around Africa and decide to help the ATT, process. But it could be in terms of institutions. Is it the RECs? Is it research institutions? Should we also have this kind of consortium of research institutions in Africa really doing something and putting things out there so that this becomes a household word? And at the national level, and the example I was going to use is the one he used, the EU assistance and sustainability. Who's going to pick up the tab once the project is over? Who is going to ensure that this is now within the development assistance framework at the national level to remind governments that, you signed the ATT, or you need to sign the ATT, or you need to ratify the ATT because this is linked to the other. I asked that question at one of the BAFA meetings that I participated in, and I didn't quite get an answer. Because for me, I thought that it would be important that the local technical and financial support to states, the diplomatic community, the UN, whoever is on ground, gets involved in these issues at the national level so that it can remain part of the development assistance framework, so that it's not kept aside and it's just when we get to the first committee discussion, but that on the ground it's there. If not, going to the question of reporting, it's not just the fatigue, it's if you want, the far from reality reports that we might end up with. Because tick the box. How many control laws do you have? Yes, right. We have laws. But what do we do with them? And if we have laws that are not enforceable, and the judges and the justice system doesn't know anything about it, Parliament adopted it but never read the ATT because somebody put pressure. So for me, I think these are the issues that are of primary importance. It's moving now from we want the ATT to enter into force to the question of the importance of the ATT, and we want really, practical disarmament or practical implementation of the ATT at the national level that we need to. So, and I think that these things require sometimes a different strategy from just what we do in our diplomatic foreign affairs circles. So these were the few thoughts I thought I could share because all the other issues had been covered, so I hope that I managed to build on a bit on what the colleagues had said.
Thank you very much, Olatokunbo, for this very insightful African perspective. It was very, very interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of food for thought for the audience, and we have, additional time for questions and answers. So feel free to, let's say, ask questions to the panelists. In doing so, we'd be grateful if you could start by introducing yourself. And there's a microphone circulating in the room, so please wait for the microphone. We'll start with Sir Ivan on the second row.
Hi, thanks. Ivan Zushkanovsky, coordinator of CSAC, the Southeast Europe Small Arms Control Program from the United Nations Development Program. It was very interesting what you said on reporting and whether UNREC has any plans to work with countries in its region to kind of enhance reporting, support them technically on this. Why I'm asking is because from our experience in Southeast Europe, a lot of the problems are political, of course, and the type of data that you're giving out, etc. But a lot of problems are purely technical. It's the capacity to actually manage the information and to have it readily available and easily available without it actually being extra burden. And what we found from our experience that when we started facilitating the data management and took out that excuse, then the political aspect became easier. And then, we worked on things like transparency, etc., which, it's a bit of a different context, of course. And the second thing, which would be the three key kind of practical implementation measures that you would like to see implemented?
Thank you, Ivan. Is there any other questions? Maybe we can pick up a few before letting the panelists answer. Yes?
Thank you. I don't have questions. I have comments. Is that allowed?
Yes.
My name is Paul Beyer. I'm with the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. I've been working on the ATT, first as a negotiator and then as a ratifier, etc., for quite a number of years. Thanks for three very rich presentations. It inspires me to all kinds of comments, but I'm going to focus on four. Firstly, the points made about the importance of ownership. It's important in Africa. I'm sure it's just as important on other continents as well. I think it's very important to stress and to work with the nexus of arms control or control of arms flows and development. That's where it hits home to people's everyday concerns. But the interesting thing is, working on that nexus is just as important in the West, because an acceptance of that link will unlock development assistance resources for the ATT. And that is significant beyond the resources that we can provide today from security policy oriented funding. As was pointed out, it also helps with the sustainability issue. So for me, that's an important message for the future for all of us. And I have to say, at least in Sweden, where I work, it's been very difficult. There's a threshold here. People who normally deal with development assistance issues are not at all happy to become associated with the legal trade in arms. So we all have a significant task ahead of us, but one that is well worth undertaking. Second point, reporting fatigue. That's not just a province of some countries. We all suffer from the same syndrome because we're all parties to the same treaties. We're all struggling with the same obligations. And to some extent, it's a matter of good administrative routines. I just thought I'd mention that the Wassenaar arrangement, which is an export control association, mainly consisting of the big producers and exporters, have worked on good administrative practices for reporting that will sort of save resources and effort and hassle simply by better organization. And we started with a sort of internal document, mainly targeting ourselves, but it was recently decided to turn that into an external document as well that could be available for all to see and to use. So on the Wassenaar website you will find a document with tips and tricks when it comes to reporting processes. Some will be applicable, some may not be, but it's quite a rich document to look at. Secrecy, which has scared the military in many parts of the world, not least Africa. I would argue that you need to urge your military to unpack the secrecy issue and look at its components and see where the ATT actually is threatening. And the reason I say this is that if they do unpack it, they will find the ATT is not threatening. Remember that all the Western countries that are behind the ATT as well also have secrecy issues. And we made very sure that our secrecy will not be compromised by the ATT, and countries in the rest of the world can benefit from that as well. It is not as big a deal as the military may feel on first glance. And I'd be happy to speak to any military about that, because we've tried to develop the arguments around that issue. Finally, implementation. Most countries in Africa, for instance, that are implementing this now are not producers. Their main role will be in controlling transit. It's really important. This is one of the major benefits of the ATT, that we will get a better handle on unregulated and illegal trade, simply because more countries are engaged in control and hopefully collaborating with each other as well within the ATT framework. So what does the ATT treaty give us in that area? Practically nothing. The ATT negotiations were, to a great extent, about export rules. And when it came to transit and transshipment, the energy had run out and the time. So we have really very rudimentary text in the treaty on the subject of transit and transshipment. What does it mean, really? Only land transit covered, or air transit, sea transit? What sort of criteria should be used for transit? Certainly not export criteria, because the transit situation is different. I would argue that fairly high up on our list of priorities, the states parties need to get together and talk about the areas of the treaty which are weak in order to provide guidance for implementation. It's perfectly possible for the states parties to get together and agree on interpretations of the text that's there. This is what is meant by transit controls. This is what is needed for a state to be compliant, because the text itself gives practically zero guidance on that topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. One last set of questions before we let the panelists answer, and then we might have time for a second round, because otherwise it's going to be very confusing. So, please, sir. You? Yeah, yes. The last one, and then we let the panelists answer. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'm Nick Marsh from the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. Just quickly following up on the comments about the SDGs and development. If we're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, the indicators to be used in measuring progress and achievement in meeting those goals are being discussed in a UN working group. It's just met in Bangkok. I'm working on this issue at the moment because there is a very big debate as to whether to include conflict deaths at all as an indicator. And there are some states do not want to include them, and so the goal in SDG 16 in terms of reducing violence, that would just be focused on homicide in the official indicators that are used. And obviously that, in terms of the linking the development to the ATT, would be very unfortunate. So if you're able to raise this, when you get back, we need to have governments actually calling for armed conflict to be included as an indicator, because at the moment there's a real chance it won't be there in the official accounting on the SDGs. I'll echo a couple of points, just more comments than questions. We've been talking about linking development and arms trade and armed violence issues for about all of the 15 years or so that I've been working on this, and presumably before that. And as Ambassador Bayer just said, it's extremely difficult to engage the development community in these issues. So it's definitely something that we can try to do more on. But I'm also worried that maybe we just have to accept that they don't want to get involved in this. Well, we'll have to see. Maybe I'm just getting too cynical, and also in terms of the, I want to emphasize again a point that was made by the two speakers. Again, in all the years I've been working on this, you see over and over again a pilot project where there's no follow-up, or a 1 or 2 year project of assistance, and then there's no follow-up. And what you end up is having an initial interest, initial building up of capacity, and then it disappears. So if there is going to be assistance for African states or states anywhere else in the world, it really has to be sustained. There really has to be a commitment from donors to say, this isn't just going to be a grant for 1 year. This has to be an ongoing relationship which will last for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Olatokunbo, would you like to start answering for the panelists? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think I hope I have not forgotten what the question was, because I was listening to Ambassador Ray and I thought he had actually answered the question for me. What should be the 3 key implementation measures?
15.
But I think on that issue, I think one of the first things that I think is important is actually the messaging. I think we can't slow down on what happened before the entry into force. Actually, I think we need to redouble our efforts now, because the tendency might be for states to say, I signed, somebody said, let's wait and see, and let's see what they make of it. So I think we need to say, yes, it's in force, but and I think one of the things, you asked the question, what are we going to be doing? We are waiting to see what happens with the establishment of the Secretariat. It is my understanding that we have an obligation, because this is a treaty, to continue to promote its universalization. But in terms of how, with whom, what, and whatever, we have to actually wait and see how but the waiting is not going to be for much longer, because apparently on the 1st of December, the Secretariat should be in existence. So we're waiting, but we're not waiting. But the emphasis should actually be on continuing the advocacy for the and I'd say again, maybe repackaging the message and expanding the group of people we are targeting in this area, the actors that we are targeting in this area. And the nexus between arms control and development, we might be fed up, frustrated, and all that, but we just can't let it go. Because at the end of the day, those who are not going to ratify will tell you their priorities are development challenges. So what are we going to say? We'll say, oh, yeah, they are, but, the Arms Trade Treaty is important if development is going to take place. It's a simple message, but it has to continue. And that's why I keep laying emphasis on the fact that we need to bring in other actors, people who know how to do it. We need to be able to work with the media to reduce the emphasis they lay on the types of arms and the decoration of the Boko Haram guys with their ammunition, to show that on one side and show how it means no schools, it means no health, it means death, it means we need to bring the media on board on this thing. You know, they need to help us break the exporter-importer the divergence and the north-south thing that keeps some countries outside the game. And maybe this is the point at which I would say to Elli that it might seem that it's not important that the P5 are on board, but I think it's so important that they're on board. And I think this is, again, I mean, this is beyond me, but I really think that we can't say, yes, it doesn't really matter, let's just go on with the others, because people keep pointing fingers and asking the question. If we are not the ones who are making the arms, then whatever. And, again, in Africa, and this is something that we are looking at, where the whole thing about locally made weapons and whatever. I'm originally from West Africa, and when I think of Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea, all these countries without borders, and the kind of arms that have been used and continue to circulate within the sub-region, I'm worried about traditional weapons as well. It's not just and once you carry it from Côte d'Ivoire to Burkina Faso, that's exportation. It's export. I mean, it's not, and we need to put that message that way. If not, we'll be missing something. And so for me, these would be the issues that I think we really need to look at. And as simple as they are, they could be complicated, but if we invest in them, and I really want to support sustainability, we need to work with people at the national level. Any form of assistance that cannot be translated into within the concept of national ownership, that are budgets, that are policies, that will reflect the need to work on this, won't last. For how long will people come, hold 3 seminars and leave, publish a report and leave? Set up a database that we're not accessing, or that we access, but the right people who need to know. So I think this is where we are. So parliaments, I think they're key. Media, I think they're key. And I think, let me stop there so that
Thank you. Is there anything you want to
Well, not necessarily. I don't have any 3 points. Maybe just 2 general things that I was scribbling down, sort of coming back to the comments from both the panelists and from the floor. Really good and interesting discussions. And for me, maybe it crystallized just generally the need to keep the momentum going in the next years. And really ensure sustainability. And I don't, with this, mean only the sustainability of assistance or national actors, but the process as a whole. We had an amazing momentum before. We had the ATT, and the speed with which we had it was great. And I think now the challenge is really what next, not only in terms of national implementation, but for the process to ensure that it keeps moving and that it stays strong. We have, unfortunately, some examples from the past where you have a political process that reaches the momentum and then something else starts creeping up, and then the old stuff tends to be forgotten when something new and sort of sexier comes along, and then all the resources move there and the attention. And I think ATT is too valuable for us to risk this happening for it. And I think it's my second point, is where we need to think strategically. I totally agree that we should ensure that we bring in all the relevant aspects and highlight the development links and gender and all the sort of non-traditional arms trade related issues that go beyond the exports and the military, to be sure that that people feel that this is really a process that is relevant for them. But I think there also what we need to avoid is sort of convoluting or confusing things and risking the fact that then people start thinking, well, what is this? That it's this and this and this and this and this, and it's linked to so many things that I don't know what it is anymore. So I guess it depends on the audience you're talking to and the target that you have in any given part of the process, but really keeping the momentum and thinking strategically about the messages that we put out there about the importance of implementation will be crucial next year and beyond.
Not much to add, except, there's always talk in Africa, certainly, about trying to be less dependent on donors. So I think these kinds of issues, including the Arms Trade Treaty, need to be integrated into most countries have national development plans. So that really these kinds of issues need to be integrated into that. And whether the IMF and the World Bank and those types of organizations should also be pushing these kinds of issues in order to get the development community to be somehow involved in these issues without being scared away. But also I just wanted to say on the ratification, some countries I know are quite clear that they won't ratify until they know that they can actually implement it. So I think some of the slowness might be sort of preparations. That's my optimistic kind of view. On the other hand, there's also that gap between what happens in New York or Geneva and what happens in the capital, which is another thing that we try and address. The lack of communication. Suddenly, somebody in the capital hears that country has signed and done something, and then they've got to implement it, and they don't know anything about it. So, those are some of the issues as well.
Thank you very much. I think we can, at this late stage, afford only a few questions and not too long comments. So I would welcome short questions to the panelists, keeping the comments possibly for, the cocktail that, is waiting for us. So with that, we'll take questions. Yes, I saw. Sir, please.
Universalization. What about normativity of the treaty, succeeding in establishing universal norms? There's a clear example, for example, of Indonesia trying to buy Dutch tanks. The Netherlands took this into consideration, and there was debate at the parliament about the implications of selling tanks to Indonesia. That was a few years ago. And because Indonesia is a nation of islands, they said, well, there's a risk of these tanks not being used against foreign armed forces, but rather against its own population. So there was a huge human rights concern. And eventually the debate became so heated that the Dutch parliament, didn't support the government in selling these tanks. And the Indonesians went to the Germans. And the Germans also made a human rights assessment, etc., etc. But eventually, they sold their tanks to Indonesia. So here you have two European states with similar culture, similar legal standards, with two different outcomes. What are your expectations about the ATT with all these countries from all parts of the world making assessments on human rights implications and coming to perhaps rather different conclusions? Mm-hmm. What are the issues concerning normativity? What are the preparations for it, and what can we expect from the ATT?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Let's pick up. I saw Jessica over there, please.
Thank you, Pierre-Arnaud, and congratulations to everybody that's spoken so far, because you've covered so many very important issues. But I think there's one aspect that we really haven't focused on, and that is the role for the states parties themselves. And I'm not talking about the assistance role. Let's take that as a given because that's part of the process that we've all accepted. But states parties in terms of the future conferences of states parties, what do you want the states parties to talk about? What do you want them to focus on? And it sort of links to the point that Paul made, is what are the next priority issues for the treaty? Because the treaty now has done its preparatory work. So what is it going to deliver? And what foundations is it going to lay for delivery? So what would be your top three for the next conference of states parties, or possibly the next three conferences of states parties? Where should states parties focus their efforts and attention?
Thank you, Jessica. I saw Tom there.
Thank you. I'm Tom Nijs. I'm a legal advisor for the Flanders Department of Foreign Affairs. And I'm one of the experts also in the EU's ATT-OP program. And I've been involved with the partner country Senegal and was also present at the seminar for the UNREC countries in Pretoria. So unlike the two people before me who posed very interesting questions, although I think that the first one is quite unanswerable. Anyway, but I just wanted to share a few experiences that I had, picking up also on the last point that Noel made there about ratification and implementation. From going to Senegal, and they're engaging with them and hearing about the experience of other Western countries, I clearly agree with the fact that ratification on itself doesn't mean much, because there is not really a difference between Western African countries and Southern African countries when it comes to implementation of the ATT, despite the fact that Western African countries have ratified the treaty. It's also, as Noel said, I think one of the causes of that is the fact that the ATT is known to diplomats, to people in the Foreign Affairs Ministry, who will pay attention to it, and they will be the motor of the ratification process. But I've learned both from working with Senegal and then talking to people also in Pretoria, that on the ground there is practically no knowledge about the ATT. So something that I found that we should focus on, but that was also what country said was first awareness raising, definitely. I have to say, when we went to Senegal, for the 2 days that we were there, we had a very fruitful discussion with more than 50 people in the room, and every stakeholder that you mentioned was there. There were not only the MFA people, there were all the ministries there. There were the Ministry of Education was present, the Ministry of Women was present, there were the media, there were the parliaments, parliamentarians, the judiciary, they were all present. So that was already a first step. But then in Pretoria also we became very much aware that was very important, and I think that awareness raising is for many countries also going to be the first step now before starting definitely on the legislative framework. Another thing that I found, which also came up here, is that regional cooperation and then interagency cooperation will be also the most thing to focus on, because we heard from previous speaker also transit is a very big issue, not so much export. Import is a very big issue, and that will only be dealt with when there is good cooperation both within a country, interagency, and then regional. And I think on both levels there's quite a bit of work to do. And then the last thing is then about their regional cooperation. I was very pleasantly surprised about the willingness that there is for this regional cooperation, and that the countries want to deal with this on a regional level. And I also found that the regional organizations that were present in Pretoria really want to be engaged and will be engaged. So the last thing that I say, when you said about linking ATT and the program of action, I think that is firstly a necessity, but I think that there's also a willingness that these organizations that engage with the UN program of action also want to focus on ATT issues. I think sometimes they need to be a bit more aware about the importance to not just focus on small arms and light weapons. And that was then the one question that I also had, because sometimes I got the feeling that there was a complete disregard for other arms. There was the pure focus on small arms, light weapons, which I understand from one side, but from the other, I think it's a bit, like I said, a disregard for that. But anyway, to conclude, I'm quite positive about the progress that we can make. I hope with you that we can extend it beyond the quite rigid format that we have with the program. But if we can, I think then that things will turn out fine.
Thank you, Tom. I think we have to leave it there. One last question from Mark. You raised the hand, and after that, I'm afraid that we have to close. So.
Just briefly, Ambassador Bayer made the point about the need to develop guidelines in terms of ATT implementation. I think it's worth flagging that there are a lot of guidelines already out there that have been developed over the last 10, 20 years about how to develop and implement effective transfer controls. And there's a lot that can be built on rather than kind of reinventing the wheel. And one of the things that CIPRI and UNREC is trying to do with the database that we're building is to make those existing guidelines available in one place, so that states have a place to go and see all the available instruments that have been developed by CSAC, by the Wassenaar arrangement, by the OSCE, in relation to brokering, to help them with ATT implementation. And then just a question, I think it just follows on from the last point. I think a lot of emphasis has been put on, particularly in the African context, the need to build links between the ATT and the POA in terms of selling them as a package of instruments that can help to address some of the issues in Africa to do with armed conflict and the availability of weapons. And just how, are there suggestions, concrete suggestions for how that can be done, given the points that have all been made about, state capacity and reporting fatigue? How can we build better links between those two instruments?
Good. So that's the last round for answers by the panelists, and then we will have to close. But we can continue this discussion, during the cocktail and possibly the dinner. Thank you very much for the questions and the comments. Final round. We start with Tokumbo.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. And I think I'll start with your question on how can we build those linkages. I think one of the first things is that through the POA, the whole move towards establishing national commissions on small arms and light weapons and whatever as an institution on the ground caught fire, as they say. And I think that we need to add that to their burden, if you want. Why? Because they're already recognized. The whole story about how small arms and light weapons are weapons of mass destruction and everybody's singing that song. I very much agree with you. We need to move beyond that. But we find that, sometimes we tend to just hold on to slogans or statements and carry on from year to year. And I think that's one of the reasons why empowering those national commissions, because they're already there. And in most of these countries, they are slowly, they have not much strength, but they're the focal point for these things. So let's begin to talk to them about it. Let's begin to find a way of reinforcing their capacity to be able to take on, even if it's only the sensitization. If we begin from there, then, we might slowly get to the to more on implementation. Secondly, it's the regional economic communities, the active ones and the inactive ones, because the way the African system has built itself around them, we just have to work with them on these issues. They see it from an economic perspective. They see it also from the peace and security perspective, because everything is rolled into these communities. So we need to move forward with them, having some kind of a role in ensuring that at least the countries within their network keep this fire burning, and that's what ECOWAS is already doing. That's why we have the study on harmonization, which includes the ATT and everything that we're finalizing with them. And finally, I think we must ensure that we link Addis to Geneva and to New York. Because I found in my years of working with Africa that if everything is happening in New York and Geneva and it's not happening in Addis, or they don't know anything about it, it's not going to get into any policy beyond, because that's where the real discussions, when the group of boys and the two girls who are now heads of states come together, that's where they actually talk. Everything in New York is speeches for everybody to be happy about, but this is where talking is done, and it's important that they're linked to it. So we need to ensure that that's taking place. Thank you.
I think I need some refreshment to think creatively about answers to the questions that were posed, the very good ones. Maybe your one about the normativity of the treaty and what could be expected. It's sort of the same thing that I tried to say at the end of my original presentation in terms of sort of what happens in the world and how that links with the ATT. And just from a sort of civil society, very much civil society perspective, all I can say is I really look forward to sort of seeing what happens, and I would like to see more debate about in the press and to see ATT referred to when these sort of things pop up. I have to say I've been a bit disappointed that even after we've had the ATT, when you have had these sort of media cases, normally what is the reference point is still the EU common position, for example, in terms of EU states, and the journalists fail to mention the ATT altogether, and at least, well, from this background, my first thing is, but they should mention that there is also now a legally binding arms trade treaty. So that's something that I would very much like to see and debate and sort of enhance the public perspective of the ATT through these sort of cases, and also thereby enhance the risk assessment process. Jessica's question about what would we like to see the state parties do in the future CSPs, going to be very boring, but the three that I could come up with are the continued discussion on reporting, and when we have the first information exchanges in, how to develop that and what that is coming to. Then more talk about this national risk assessment process and licensing, how that is going, if there's a way of analysing that as part of the CSPs. And finally, sort of linked to what Paul said, if possible, look deeper into some aspects that were left a bit out or with less attention in the actual treaty negotiations, whether that relates to the activities that are covered by the treaty or the famous issue of definitions. If there's a way of taking those into the discussion at the future meetings, I think that would be very helpful. Thank you.
I don't have much to say. I mean, I was a bit worried that there were two Africans on the panel, because I thought, what is the consortium trying to say? Maybe they were worried about implementation in Africa. But I think we've heard from the comments and the questions that it's all the same common problems of implementation all over the world. So I'm quite grateful for that. And I'm quite confident we'll do our bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. Thank you very much to all. I mean, I think the timing speaks for itself, It's been very interesting. So I think we can collectively thank the panelists